Michigan football earned a big win on the road over a rival. A shutout 49 to nothing win. And oh, by the way, you can remove big win from the equation. Yes, Michigan, obviously, as we could see from that final touchdown by Alex Orji, was motivated to enter East Lansing and pour it on and put on a performance. And indeed they did. McCarthy threw for nearly 300 yards. He's now the front runner for the Heisman according to betting odds. Blake Corum got a touchdown. Roman Wilson got a touchdown. Colston Loveland, I think, had 2 or 3 receiving touchdowns. And the defense pitched a shutout and even had 2 interceptions, 1 returned for 6 by Mike Sainristil, one of my favorite players on the team. And yeah, Michigan wanted this win, and they were clearly engaged, and it was an impressive performance. By all accounts, if you use the eye test, Michigan by far is the number 1 team in the country. Anyone who tells me that there's another team by the eye test that's more impressive than Michigan, I don't believe you, straight up. But we can have a conversation about that in the comments section. What is true, though, a criticism about Michigan that I have levied for several weeks, is they have faced no one who can challenge them. Now, they have had moments of adversity, which is good. That will help them build up tolerance to challenge, which I expect them to face in some form against Penn State, probably a greater form against Ohio State in the game, because Ohio State looks like, in some regards, a totally different program in both the good and the bad compared to the past 2 seasons where Michigan has bludgeoned them. But Michigan has not faced anyone who can truly challenge them. Michigan State's a rival. Michigan State typically gets up to play Michigan. Michigan State had energy in the crowd and on the sidelines and from their team. They had energy for about 1 or 2 drives, and then Michigan just killed them. They straight up killed them. Michigan State put on the worst performance of any Big Ten conference opponent Michigan has faced all season. I still think Michigan State is better than Indiana by virtue of raw talent, and I don't think Indiana has a good coaching staff either. Both the Spartans and the Hoosiers have pretty terrible coaching staffs, but Indiana at least shut out Michigan for a quarter and scored on the road. They put on a better performance than Michigan State did, and obviously Minnesota did. Obviously Nebraska did. I think we can all agree on that. Nebraska was able to get into Michigan territory in the first half. They just couldn't finish because they wanted to win. And Rutgers for sure. By the way, great job by Greg Schiano picking up that 6th win. It's awesome to see Rutgers going bowling and improve as a program. But regardless, whether it's the first 3 games against East Carolina, UNLV, Bowling Green, or the 5 conference wins against Rutgers, Nebraska, Minnesota, Indiana, and Michigan State, Michigan has not faced a challenge yet. And I want the challenge as a Michigan fan and also from a college football fan perspective, because this Michigan team, for example, I can see this realistically happening. I could see Michigan going into Beaver Stadium and it looks like 2019 LSU versus Alabama at halftime, where Michigan's up by 2 or 3 scores at the half. That's how good this team looks via the eye test. The problem is, again, they faced weaker opponents than Penn State, Ohio State, and just about every team in the Big Ten has right now. They have one of the weakest strength of schedules in all of America. Welcome back, fellow football fanatics. It's college football with Sam, and Michigan State, I think they've survived the worst. Yes, they have to play Ohio State and Penn State. However, Michigan, I think most of us can agree on, looks like the best team in the Big Ten. Michigan was extra motivated to play this game, and this is Michigan State's Super Bowl, their biggest game of the year. So to have this behind them, they're looking forward to get a new head coach. They're trying to keep some players who are good on the roster. Michigan State right now is weathering the worst of it. For Michigan, they're approaching the toughest slate of their schedule, which is Penn State, Maryland, and Ohio State. This is the best Big Ten football channel on the tube, so please do us a favor and hit that subscribe button so we can get to 20,000 subscribers by the end of the 2023 season, and also click the notification bell so you can get notified when I post game previews and reactions for the rest of Michigan football's games. Same with Ohio State football, and we also talk about, Penn State, Michigan State, Nebraska, Ohio State, Michigan, obviously, and every Big Ten team. I'm going to do a Minnesota and Iowa reaction because that was quite an intense game and a big win for PJ Fleck. And we also cover USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington, as they're going to join the Big Ten next season. And I try and touch on college football games and events all across the country. So hit the notification bell if you want more exciting, quality college football content. Like the video, comment your reaction to this game down below, and also check out my Patreon page via the link in the description if you want to support the channel and, depending on your tier, get some extra content. Back to the video. Michigan, really what was so impressive about this performance and really about Michigan's season is just their efficiency. This is the most efficient team in the country. JJ McCarthy remains number one in QBR, which is just nuts. If you would have told me that in the preseason, I would have thought you were on drugs, but 93.7 quarterback efficiency rating. He had a 97.7 quarterback efficiency rating in this matchup against Michigan State, which is a high for this season in 2023. That's his season high. Last year, he had a 99.9 and a 99.2 efficiency rating against Hawaii and Colorado State. So this performance against Michigan State was not the highest in his career by efficiency metrics. However, for throwing 27 times and really being the backbone of the offense in a lot of ways, because Michigan State does have a good defensive line, they have a good linebacker core, and they were blitzing every play. They wanted to shut down the run, and that's what the rumors said was Scotty Hazelton's game plan, was shutting down the run. Well, he limited the run. The problem is Michigan just tore up that secondary. 287 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns, a 216 passer rating, a 97.7 quarterback efficiency rating, and only 1 sack, and also 8 yards on the ground for JJ McCarthy. It was a very impressive performance by Michigan. They shut out the Spartans, and again, most efficient team in all of college football. You look at ESPN's FPI, Michigan's at number 2. Earlier in the year, I said that FPI was underrating Michigan. Well, here's the thing. Michigan is replicating their extremely efficient performances every Saturday. These other teams who maybe in the beginning of the season looked invincible or who had phenomenal games against top-tier competition, they're not replicating that level of success. Now, many of them have played tougher schedules, but you look at ESPN's efficiency metrics, Michigan is 96 points. At number 2 is Ohio State with 89.6. Number 3 is Florida State with 88.6. And number 4 is Penn State with 88.4. There's a big gap in terms of efficiency, in terms of Michigan and the rest of the country, in terms of, utilizing their talent in the best way possible and putting their players in the best position to win. Michigan is the second most efficient offense and the second most efficient defense, according to efficiency metrics and ESPN analytics. The special teams is still low at 112th. But again, I think a lot of that is due to the fact Michigan has not had to use their special teams unit much, if at all. They kicked 1 field goal against Indiana. They punted, I think, a few times against Michigan State, but a lot of that was late in the game, counts as garbage time, so most analytics, and myself included, don't take much of that into account. Michigan, they punted 4 times, an average of nearly 47 yards per punt by Tommy Doman, 1 inside the 20. I think analytics underrates Michigan's special teams unit. And Jack Tuttle, Jaden Denegal, Alex Orji, they all got playing time. I mean, this team is deep. They're one of the best, if not the best teams in the country. And in points per play margin and yards per point margin, the analytics I use to help calculate games when I do potential power predictions, and when I talk about potential power in my preview and prediction videos, Michigan's number 1 in those by a mile. I mean, it's crazy how advanced they are. Again, the only critique is strength of schedule. And if Michigan goes into Beaver Stadium and blows out Penn State or beats them by double digits, well, the criticism of strength of schedule is immediately neutered. It is what it is. I'm very excited for that game. Pardon me if I mention that throughout the video, but Michigan's on a bye. They play Purdue at home. In my mind, you should start preparing for Penn State now, because Penn State will be in wounded animal mode. If they go 10-2 again and go to a New Year's Six Bowl again, even if they win, the season would be considered relatively somewhat of a disappointment, while last year was more of a bounce back that exceeded media expectations. There were people who picked Penn State to win the Big Ten this season, and with how they looked yesterday, and with how Michigan has looked, and how Ohio State beat them, and the fact that Illinois, Northwestern, and Iowa, all division crossover conference games for Penn State, all those teams lost, Penn State's title hopes are in jeopardy. They need that win over Michigan to stay alive, and they need those teams in the West to start winning, because if a three-way tie occurs, the team with the toughest Big Ten West crossover slate goes to Indy in the three-way tie. And right now, that looks to favor, based off of results from yesterday and trying to project future games, that's probably going to be Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State in third. I think Iowa's destined to lose some more games, even with their schedule, based off of how horrific that offense is. You will never not hear me criticize Iowa's offense when I have the chance to. It's just that bad. JJ McCarthy was the player of the game. Speaking of offense, Michigan is one of the best offenses in the country. I never thought I would say that. But yesterday, the Wolverines were 7 of 11 on third down. They had 28 first downs. They had nearly 500 total yards, 477 to be exact. 357 of those yards are passing, and 287 of those were by JJ McCarthy, who went 21 of 27 for 287 yards and 4 passing touchdowns. Bullet after bullet, accurate pass after accurate pass. He had one ill-advised throw where if he was playing Penn State's defense or Ohio State's defense, I think it would have been a pick, but that was one pass out of 27. Every other pass was phenomenal. I mean, there were 2 balls where he had perfect placement, and whether it was broken up or the receiver dropped it, just couldn't get a connection. But it was a great performance by JJ McCarthy. There's no doubt about that. McCarthy has put himself in position to now be the leader when it comes to odds in the Heisman race. He doesn't even have 2,000 passing yards yet. He doesn't have 20 passing touchdowns either. I think he'll have to have big performances against Penn State and Ohio State in order to even have the chance to go to New York, because he's had one game this season where he's had 30 passing attempts against East Carolina. He only has 169 pass attempts on the season. That's less than Kyle McCord. That's less than Drew Aller. He has 1,799 passing yards. He's completing 78% of his passes, 18 passing touchdowns, only has 3 interceptions, all against Bowling Green. And he has 168 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. JJ McCarthy this year reminds me of 2021 through 2022 Stetson Bennett with a higher ceiling. I mean, the way that he's able to lead the team, he's a leader. He can manage the game. You have some of that upside. And even though he doesn't have the biggest frame, much like Stetson Bennett, nor is he known for having a Joe Milton cannon arm, JJ McCarthy can scramble and do it rather well. The breakaway speed that JJ McCarthy has is very impressive. You can tell that he's become faster over the preseason and even this season as well. He's just really an elite quarterback. And I know Michigan hasn't faced anyone yet, and they played a terrible secondary, but McCarthy has played near perfect football in 7 games out of 8. And the Bowling Green game, it's safe to say that game is probably near a fluke. I'm not going to attach myself to that opinion that he's an elite quarterback until I see how he does against Penn State. But what helps McCarthy is he has a great tight end in Colston Loveland, another great tight end in A.J. Barner. Donovan Edwards looks still better as a receiver than a running back. And Roman Wilson and Cornelius Johnson are great wide receivers. I'd say Roman Wilson and also tight end Colston Loveland are near elite, maybe elite in the case of Loveland at their positions. So this offense is humming in large part because of JJ McCarthy. Sharon Moore and Jim Harbaugh trust McCarthy more than they did last year. They also need him more than they did last year because Michigan's offensive line, and also by virtue of opposing defenses stacking the box more than they did last season, Michigan, they don't have the same run game that they did last year. That's very evident. Blake Corum is not even top 25 in total yards. He isn't. Now, I think Michigan's run game, whether it's against Penn State or whether it's against Ohio State, there will be a big game that I think the rushing attack will pop off. I don't know which. Donovan Edwards still has not had a breakout performance, and I still think he will. But Michigan's passing offense, I mean, there is no denying that this passing offense is great to near elite. And the reason for that is Michigan, through 8 games last year, faced one good team. One team, in truth, that mattered. Maybe 1.5 if you count Maryland, but Maryland finished 8-5. They played Michigan almost too close for comfort. That team was Penn State. And against other opponents, Michigan really struggled to put together a consistent passing offense, and they really went run heavy. They struggled in the red zone. None of that this year. Michigan, in exchange for using their run game less, they've kept their running backs healthier as a consequence, but they also, it's a little bit of a change in identity. The offense is completely opened up. Michigan can kill you on the ground. They can kill you through the air. They assassinate with precision on any type of pass at any distance with any route. It's very impressive to watch. Again, this is by eye test and this is by efficiency. We have not seen Michigan play a Notre Dame or a Penn State or Ohio State. The best team that Michigan has played all season is either Rutgers or Minnesota. Those teams are probably average Power 5 teams. Maybe we'll look back at those teams and say they're above average Power 5 teams, but that's probably best case scenario. Rutgers, by the way, is 6-2, and Minnesota is 4-3. Nebraska's also 4-3, but I think Minnesota has a higher ceiling than Nebraska. I also think Rutgers, by virtue of having more wins and having a more consistent offense, is better than Nebraska. But Michigan, in games yesterday, their strength of schedule looked more impressive, but they haven't really faced much challenge, if any challenge. And that's an area where you can be excited if you're a college football fan and a Michigan fan to see who this team is. Based off of the previous 2 seasons, it's somewhat safe to assume that this team will translate the success they're having right now to a realistic level against top competition. Michigan in 2021 and 22, after all, beat Ohio State, and in 2022 they only lost to eventual runner-up TCU by 6 in what's largely considered partially a fluke game. Still a win for TCU, though. And they also beat Penn State that season and dominated them. So Michigan, it would be, I think, foolish to think that what they're doing will just fall off and collapse against Penn State and Ohio State. The question is, Ohio State being more battle-tested and having a defense that I think is more proven and still having explosiveness on offense. Will Ohio State be able to, find holes that we haven't seen yet in Michigan? Are we undervaluing Ohio State because they haven't passed the eye test as much as Michigan has, but that might be due to the fact they've played tougher teams? And for Penn State, this game's on the road in Beaver Stadium. Penn State has a very stingy defense, and Aller has performed better at home. Can Penn State expose anything? Any holes or weaknesses for the Michigan Wolverines? We'll have to see. I think JJ McCarthy right now, eye test, adjusting for competition, and factoring in that Michael Penix struggled and some other critiques I have of different quarterbacks, I'd say he's top 4. I think he's moved from top 5 to top 4. Caleb Williams, you look at the statistics of Caleb Williams against top 25 defenses, it's pretty jarring. I think Jaden Daniels with what he has done week after week after week. Very impressive with him. Penix had an off game, but I'm treating his game against Arizona State like I did McCarthy's against Bowling Green. I think unless Penix is hurt, that's a wake-up call for Washington more than a red flag. But maybe that's just my opinion. I want to talk about Michigan State because we haven't talked about them much throughout this video. The reason for that being there isn't really much to talk about. The team has given up, to be frank. And at this point, if you're Michigan State, you're trying to keep players who matter from going into the portal. You're trying to find your next head coach, assistants, etc. This entire staff will be gone. They will. Scotty Hazelton will not be retained. Jay Johnson will not be retained. Ross Ells, he should be excluded in a 1,000-mile radius from East Lansing because Michigan State special teams is just an atrocity. Heck, same with Jay Johnson and Scotty Hazelton. The offense and defense has been horrible all year. They were horrid last year. Jay Johnson was carried by Kenneth Walker in 2021, and Hazelton just... The only reason the defense was competent in 21 at times was because of D'Antonio recruits, like Jacob Panashuk, for example. What's shameful about Michigan State is the Spartans have players that, if they were put in the right position and if they were developed properly, could be great, could be all conference. In my opinion, in the case of Simeon Barrow, and if Jacoby Windman could be All-American. Now, some of you might think that's a stretch, but I look at Michigan State, I look at their secondary. Michigan's tight ends look like giants. It's David and Goliath is what Michigan's Colston Loveland and AJ Barner are next to Michigan State's secondary players, except the secondary players, they don't have a slingshot. And you know how the rest of the story goes. They do not have God's guidance. They have Scotty Hazelton's guidance, which is an atrocity. We don't need to go into further detail. But at linebacker and on the defensive line, you have potent players. You really do. Aaron Brule's a good player. Cal Halliday, great tackler. Jordan Hall has been eye-popping as a true freshman. You have Tunmise Adeleye, who, high 4-star talent, recruited by Texas A&M. You have Zion Young, Simeon Barrow Jr., I think, all Big Ten, All-American potential. You have players. The players really have not been the problem for Michigan State. Now, they don't have Michigan, Penn State, or Ohio State players, but what I'm saying is Mark D'Antonio had the same level of players when it came to recruiting and team talent composite ratings, and he won championships, albeit in a Big Ten that I don't think has the same caliber of teams that it does now. When Mark D'Antonio made his run from 2010 to 2015, it was basically Michigan State and Ohio State with, Wisconsin in 2010 and 2011. Michigan and Ohio State, their teams right now outside of Ohio State in 14 and 15, their teams right now are better than any of those teams were in that 5 teams radius. And this year's Penn State team and prior Penn State teams under Franklin probably could have won more than just one Big Ten championship if they were, teleported to that reality. Just potentially, not saying for sure. D'Antonio did play in a slightly weaker, if not potentially majorly weaker Big Ten. However, I think if Mark D'Antonio prime was here right now with Michigan State, you'd see upsets. Mark D'Antonio in his prime was a genius. Outcoaching Urban Meyer, owning Urban Meyer in 13, beating him on the road with a backup quarterback and coaching circles around him in 15, and winning the Big Ten in 15, fielding one of the best defenses in the history of modern football in 13, one of the most innovative as well, with the no-fly zone, which Harlan Barnett helped coach. Props to him on that. And in 10, coming out of nowhere and winning the conference. And in 11, competing for the conference again. but falling to Wisconsin, unfortunately, in Indianapolis. The players are not the problem. The coaches are. What Michigan State wants ideally is someone who can coach up their players, like Mark D'Antonio did, but who can recruit better. That's the dream. That's what Michigan State wanted in Tucker, and that's what they thought they got in Tucker after that 11-2 season. It was phenomenal. The players were coached up. Yeah, the secondary was horrible, but they could make a play. And the front seven was great. The offensive line was serviceable. Thorne was good. The receivers were great to near elite. And Kenneth Walker III was just best of the best, cream of the crop at running back. And Michigan State found ways to win. They could have easily gone 7-5 in 2021 instead of 10-2, but they went 10-2. They found ways to win against Indiana, against Michigan, against Miami, against Penn State. Teams that all those games you could have flipped the coin the other way and Michigan State lost. But Tucker wasn't that. And this is another game that shows why Tucker was not going to work here, even if the allegations didn't come out. Much like Scott Frost in 2022, if Frost wasn't fired until the end of the year, does Nebraska get whipped at home by Oklahoma? No. But they probably still lose, and they probably still have a losing record, and they probably look worse nonetheless compared to 2021, and they probably don't beat Iowa at the end of the year. They probably end up blowing that game. Case in point, it was the right move to fire Frost then and there. For Mel Tucker, let's say the sexual harassment allegations and accusations put forth by Brenda Tracy. Let's say those never come out. Let's just poof, gone. Michigan State still gets blown out by Washington. I guarantee you Michigan still wins and covers what the current spread was. They probably don't get the shutout. They probably don't score 49, but they probably still dominate. Maybe Iowa or Rutgers comes out to be a win, but one of them remains a loss, and I bet Maryland still beats Michigan State. Noah Kim was the starting quarterback to begin the year. He looks like a MAC-level quarterback. And Katin Houser's clearly better. He has potential, but he's a lot like Aller in the sense that he's raw, untested, and he does not have the supporting cast or coaching to improve him as a player, at least right now. And from what we know, I have more faith that Aller will improve next year than Houser will, if Houser decides to stay at Michigan State, that is. And this is the other problem. Michigan State gave up. The coaching is absolute garbage. It's gutter trash. The only coach who I think Courtney Hawkins should stay on Michigan State's staff. I really think he should. The next head coach at Michigan State should keep Hawkins. He should. The wide receivers, I have no qualms about the wide receivers. None. And Courtney Hawkins can recruit. The problem is Noah Kim and even to a great degree Houser have not been able to get the receivers the ball, and losing Jaden Reed and losing Keon Coleman after last year really hurt. Obviously setting the wide receiver room further behind than was anticipated because you were expecting Keon Coleman to return and be a part of the team this season. And in his case, good decision on him. Good on him for leaving, and same with Peyton Thorne. They're doing better and at least staying healthier, and they have less risk of an injury than they are playing for Michigan State this season. The trenches also, not just defensively, but on the offensive line. Nick Samak, Gino Van DeMark, Spencer Brown. This offensive line, Todd Blackledge, the announcer for this game, said that Michigan State, he was surprised they weren't running the football better because they had a good O-line. Well, that's very laughable. It shows sometimes that the announcers don't watch these games or are maybe trying to make certain teams feel better, whether it's talking up Michigan and Ohio State, which is understandable because they were elite last year. They're probably both the two best teams in the Big Ten this season. It's annoying, but there's a reason for it. Or trying to make the Indianas or Northwesterns of the world feel better. Michigan State does not have a good O-line, but they have the potential to have an elite O-line. Or maybe, I'm going to say great. Elite maybe if they had Sharon Moore or Matt Luke or Kyle Flood or Alex Mirabal coaching their offensive line. There are players on the offensive line that have been recruited well and nurtured and developed at a decent level, but Chris Kapilovic is not, again, like most of these assistants outside of Courtney Hawkins, not a great, not even good, in fact, a pretty below average to bad assistant, and yet he's paid $1 million. So for Michigan State, they have guys who can return next year. They do. Their wide receiver core is very young. Nathan Carter, Michigan State and the donors should do everything they can to keep him. He's a great running back. It's not his fault that he averaged 2 yards per carry against a defense that was extra motivated to beat their rival and a defense that is definitely top 3 in the nation. And in terms of all statistics outside of yards allowed per game, number 1. I think it's Michigan, Ohio State, maybe Penn State for number 1 defense in the nation. Penn State just doesn't have the benefit of having a good offense that keeps them off the field, so that's why I have them being number 1, despite the fact that they had some vulnerabilities against Ohio State. But Katin Houser, Nathan Carter, Christian Fitzpatrick, Monterey Foster Jr., I don't know if Trey Mosley has any more years of eligibility, but there are players whom I think it's in Michigan State's best interest to try and keep at the school. Simeon Barrow Jr., I don't know off the top of my head if he has any eligibility, but I think he has a year, maybe 2. I think he's a junior or a senior still with the COVID eligibility option. I know Tunmise Adeleye has more eligibility. I think Zion Young does as well. I think this is Chris Bogle's last year, but again, I don't know. For the Spartans, it's really right now, you're 0-5. Barnett has done a good job of keeping the team, I'd say, their heads up. It's hard for me to find a compliment. I think Harlan Barnett's a man of great character, but I don't think he's head coaching material. And I think that he's done a good job of helping to make sure the team's healing and that they don't get, grounded by the Mel Tucker situation. But in terms of in-game coaching, just awful. Straight up awful. So the job really for Michigan State, I think, is keeping the good players from transferring away. And the Spartans can help themselves by the minute the regular season ends announcing who their next head coach is and not, playing the waiting game out too long. Let's talk about Michigan, though, once again. 477 offensive yards, 7 touchdowns, including a defensive touchdown. They pitched their first shutout since 2022 against UConn. Michigan, through the first 8 games of last season, allowed over 10 points per game. This included allowing 24 points to Maryland, 17 to Penn State, 7 to Michigan State, which all of that was practically on Keon Coleman. Also allowing a few points to Colorado State, allowing 14 to Hawaii, most of those were backups, etc. Michigan this season, through 8 games, is allowing 5.9 points per game. Michigan has scored 4 defensive touchdowns, all of whom were caused by starters, and including backups have only allowed 5 touchdowns on defense. Michigan's also scoring 40.6 points per game, which was 7th nationally. They're top 50 in rushing yards with 174.3 per game. They're almost top 50 in passing yards with 247.4 per game. This offense is very efficient. If the offense had to win a game on its own, I don't know the answer to whether they could win that way. But the defense, no questions about Jesse Minter's defense. None whatsoever. Again, big plays through the air have been a problem, but we didn't see any of that with this game against Michigan State. We really didn't. And I think that's going to be something that over the bye week, Jesse Minter and Jim Harbaugh and Steve Clinkscale and Mike Elston and Chris Partridge, linebackers coach and great recruiter, they're going to discuss defensively. It's how they can improve the defense. This is what great and elite staffs do. Manny Diaz, for example, and Penn State, and Curtis Jacobs, he talked about how in the loss to Ohio State, it's going off on a tangent, I know, but he said he took responsibility. He didn't blame the offense. He took responsibility. And I imagine Cooper DeJean did the same with Iowa. You do what you can do. You focus on your individual efforts and the efforts of the team that you are a part of, whether that's, the fraction of the team, the defensive or offensive side of the ball, or the whole team if you're a head coach, and especially if you're a quarterback. But Manny Diaz and Penn State and Anthony Poindexter, they're going to go over and they are going to try and fix their side. They're not going to go over to, the offense and, tell them what to do. They're going to, look at themselves and focus on what they can do, how they can become an even better defense than the elite defense they already are. For Michigan, they have great to elite staffs on both sides of the ball, which means that Michigan has the potential, in my mind, just like Ohio State. Ohio State, I think, is a great near elite. Throw that all out. They have an elite offensive staff. The problem is they don't have C.J. Stroud at quarterback, and offensive line recruiting from Greg Studwara is just hammering them every game. And there's injuries. But they have a elite offensive staff and an elite defensive staff. Georgia, defensively, is elite. Offensively, I know that Carson Beck and the offense outside of him hasn't performed at this phenomenal level, but right now Mike Bobo, I think, is doing a serviceable job there. There are very few staffs in the country that are elite and well-rounded. Michigan's one of them. So I think over this bye week, you're going to see them get even better. Against Purdue, it's a game that you can't overlook. Purdue is 2-5, yes, but they have a solid quarterback in Hudson Card. They have Devin Mockabee at running back, and their defense is very effective at getting to the passer. And Michigan's weakness on offense, I think, is pass protection. I don't think it's passing the football. I don't even think it's running the football. I think it's pass protection, as advertised by the Indiana game, partially by the Michigan State game as well. Michigan State was able to sack McCarthy once, and they were able to pressure him a few more times. But thankfully, McCarthy is aware enough, elusive enough, and strategic enough to often turn pressure points into big plays, which is why the passing offense is great. Does Michigan have the best defense? Statistically, they do, but raw stats, their weaknesses, they cannot adjust for things that aren't numbers, like emotion. And I know that strength of schedule and strength of record, you can assign a numerical value to it, but really, since you never truly know the complete ins and outs of every team, there's a lot of variance with that strength of schedule and strength of record number. That's the weakness of raw statistics. And Michigan, this season, I just quickly pull this up and find it, they do not have an impressive strength of schedule. They have the 9th strength of record. Very impressive. When it comes to current strength of schedule, Michigan has the 110th strength of schedule. That's the worst in the Big Ten, according to ESPN Analytics. Indiana's, conversely, is 2nd. Iowa's is 13th. Rutgers is 17th. Michigan State is 18th. Ohio State is 20th. Penn State's 24th. Penn State's was 110th before their game against Ohio State, but since Ohio State's number 1 in FPI and they played on the road, Penn State gets a big bump. But outside of Michigan, for example, Penn State on their schedule has Michigan left at home, they have Rutgers at home, and they have road games at Maryland and at Michigan State and a home matchup against Indiana this weekend. So Michigan has the second hardest remaining strength of schedule in all of college football because they play Maryland on the road, Penn State on the road, and Ohio State at home. And really the only easy game is at home against Purdue. And Michigan being the number 1 team in the Big Ten by AP poll ranking and the number 2 team nationally is going to have a big target on its back. Is this the nation's best defense? Well, we'll just have to see how they do against Penn State, and especially how they do against Ohio State. All I know is Michigan held Michigan State to under 200 total yards. They forced 2 turnovers. They held Michigan State to 10 first downs and only 25 minutes of possession. Michigan got to Katin Houser often. They sacked him and Sam Leavitt 3 times. They had 9 tackles for loss, 7 passes deflected, and 2 interceptions. I was very impressed with Michigan's performance. What can I say? But it's on to the bye week for Michigan. For Michigan State, up next, they do have a final home game against Nebraska on November 4th. But before then, they have to travel on the road to play a Minnesota team who's coming off of a emotional road win over Iowa. Maybe a letdown spot for the Gophers, who've lost to the likes of Northwestern and struggled to Louisiana. We'll see. Michigan as an early 7-point underdog in that matchup. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I want to give a quick shout out to my patrons before we finish. Spencer Bringhurst, Noah DDLC, thank you for being my All-American patrons. Remember, if you're an All-American or Heisman patron, you get insider access to my potential power rankings, which picked Michigan, by the way, to win by 52 points. Michigan ended up winning by 49. In Ohio State, potential power picked Ohio State to win by 15. The Buckeyes won by 8, but they were up by 14 for much of the fourth quarter until the final 30 seconds of the game when Penn State scored what amounted to, after they failed the onside kick, as a garbage time touchdown. Thank you to Will Loftus, Gabriel Callender, Roaming Gnome, and Matthew Sale for being my all-conference patrons. Have a phenomenal day, guys, and I will see you all around. Bye-bye.